So the idea that I was putting across last time, which is the idea that neurotic struggle or neurotic suffering is the result of a mismatch between our map and reality. It doesn't seem like necessarily that elegant a model, because we could say, well, that's obviously true. If we're not seeing things right, we're going to make a mess. If our theory misses stuff out, we're going to get things wrong. It's not going to work out for us. So that doesn't sound like a hugely brilliant theory. But the point isn't just that our map is not quite good enough, or that it misses a few details or it needs to be tweaked. Our map is as wrong could be. It couldn't be wronger. No matter how hard we tried to make a wronger map or a wronger model of reality, we couldn't. That's not possible. And the reason it's so wrong is because, going back to what I was saying earlier, our map of reality, our basic understanding of reality, the blueprint that we work on, is basically that there are these two things, self and other, and everything can be understood in terms of that. And on the one hand, we might agree with that and say, well, I suppose that's got to be true, really, because here's me, I'm the self, and there's other stuff and other people, and that's the other. So in a subjective way, it makes perfect sense. But we're not looking into it deeply enough, because the whole thing about this, the whole thing about saying that the map is made up of self and other, is that straight away we're saying that's two things, and it isn't actually two things, because self creates other and other creates self, and they both create each other mutually. So they're a mutually creating pair, which means they're actually the one thing, that each bit needs the other bit in order to exist, because you can't have self without other, and you can't have other without self. So what that means is that our map isn't made up of two things, it's made up of one thing. So that's a bit funny in itself, because what kind of a map is that? But it gets worse. Worse in terms of how good a fit our map is for reality, because this type of a thing that we're talking about, a mutually creating pair, i.e. a polarity, plus minus, up down, left right, in out, yes no, positive minus, isn't an actual feature of reality. It doesn't belong in reality. It's not part of reality. Polarities aren't reality. In other words, reality is non-polar. It's not made up of two mutually creating opposites. Because the thing about two mutually creating or two mutually generating opposites is that although you've got a very neat little system there, its very nature means that nothing ever happens in it. There's no events in it. There's no genuine events in it, only apparent events that show themselves to be false later on. And the reason we can say this is because of the basic nature of a polarity. It's made up of two opposites. Two opposites cancel each other out. So if I'm living in this world that is bounded by one opposite on one side and the other opposite on the other side, and everything I do makes sense in terms of those two opposites, as it surely does, and as much as I'm orientated in a polar way in terms of pairs of opposites, up, down, in, out, then everything in that world is ultimately going to be cancelled out, because it's all created of plus and minus in equal amounts. And we all know that when you've got an equal amount of pluses and an equal amount of minuses, you haven't got anything. And that's really just another way of talking about waves. A wave is a self-cancelling event, just like a polarity is. And a wave is a polarity. It's just, we don't usually think of it as being such. It's a polarity because a wave, if you look at the amplitude of the crest, how high up it is, it reaches a point where it's at the very, very highest, and it goes down and down and down till it reaches the level where it's zero, and then it goes down and down even further till it reaches that negative amplitude, which was equal to the positive amplitude, i.e. the minus that is equal to the plus. And at the end of all that, the plus cancels out the minus, and the minus cancels out the plus, and it's a null event, which is fair enough. That's what waves are. They're null events. And in the same way, this polarity of self versus other creates a world, a virtual world, that is ultimately completely self-cancelling, just as all polarities are self-cancelling. They're not real things. Therefore, if we use a polarity as our basic map or model for reality, we're using an unreal thing to model a real thing. And so, as I started off by saying, what could be more of a misfit than that? What could be wronger than that? I'm trying to model the real in terms of the unreal. And that's pretty wrong. I can't make it right. I can't improve my model. I can't tinker about with it. I can't tinker about with it to make it a better fit for reality. It doesn't matter what the hell I do with it. It's so wrong that the only thing to do with it is throw it out. But the problem there is that we don't want to throw it out. And why, we might ask, don't we want to throw it out? Considering that it's so very absurdly misfitting with, in terms of reality, so incongruous, so incoherent. Well, I don't want to throw it out because that particular polarity, me versus others, is very, very, very precious to me. It's the most precious thing ever. I have huge attachment to it because it's me. The polarity of self-other is the same thing as self, because that's what the self is. It's self-stroke-other. It's a polarity. It's not one thing. It's two mutually creating things, which you can't have one without having the other as well. And as well as being mutually creating, they're also mutually cancelling, just like plus and minus are always mutually cancelling. So it's a polarity. It suffers from the disadvantages of polarity, i.e. it isn't real. It's a kind of a trick or a fiction that appears to be real when we don't look at it properly enough. But when we do look at it properly enough, we see that it isn't real. And then that's the end of that. If we put our eggs in that basket, we realize there isn't a basket, and the eggs fall to the floor and they all get broken, as is invariably the case with unreal baskets. But that's me. That unreal thing, that fiction, is the most important thing in the world. It's who I see myself to be. Everything else gets measured in terms of that. I measure the whole world in terms of me, what it means to me, whether it's a good thing in terms of me or a bad thing in terms of me, whether it helps or hinders, offers me advantage or disadvantage, whether I can use it or whether maybe it'll use me. So the self is the yardstick with which I measure the whole universe. And this, in using this as a yardstick, I never come across anything that doesn't relate to me. So stuff that doesn't relate to the yardstick of me is so irrelevant to me that I don't see it and never encounter it. And yet, stuff that does make sense in terms of the yardstick of me, or who I take myself to be, is unreal because the polarity, which is me, is unreal. So everything that gets validated or made relevant in terms of that yardstick is also unreal. So in other words, the polarity isn't just me, the polarity is the whole thought-created world that comes out of using me as a basis or a center. So then, as soon as we see that, we can see that this is bound to cause problems, because I'm leaning very heavily on this thing, this map of reality, which is fundamentally all about me. It's an identity-centric map, and yet there isn't one, or it doesn't actually relate to reality at all. It's just stuff that makes sense in terms of a polarity, and polarities don't exist. They're kind of funny things that appear to exist, as I said, when you don't look at them too closely. In other words, they're illusions, which is perhaps a more familiar way of putting it. So obviously, to rely very, very heavily on this yardstick, which is an illusion, and which makes everything else be an illusion, if I insist on using it to understand everything, that's not going to pan out in the long run. It's not going to go anywhere. It's got no possibilities in it at all, apart from the possibility of endlessly going up and down, or going round and around and around and around. So that's why we can say that the map is so very wrong. But then we can always say, okay, my map's wrong, fair enough, I'm flexible, I'm adaptable, let's make a map that is right. You can always say that. So if this map of self and other, which appear to be two different things but which are the same thing, is a bad map because it's completely wrong, because it's not a real thing, what can I change? How can I change that? If I could change it. And of course we can say, well, get rid of the self, because if there is no self, if the self is created by an arbitrary boundary, and in life, as we know, there are no real boundaries, only the boundaries that we make up to try and inflict some kind of order on things, then get rid of that boundary, and is that a good map? Perhaps if we get rid of the self, what would be left? You could say, well, it's just everything in that case. But that doesn't help us so much, because we can't say what everything is. We can't make a map of it. We can't use it as a basis for orientating ourselves. A map works as a map because it's simpler or more simplified than the territory is trying to explain. So if I'm forced to resort to saying, okay, I'm going to have a map that is exactly as complex as the territory is trying to explain, that's just pure stupid, because I don't need it. I've already got the territory. So I'm saying I need a model that is just as complex as the territory to explain the territory. But I don't need to bother because the territory is already there. So why do I need that? Do you know, it's just stupid. So that doesn't work either. So then we can say, well, how do we navigate in the world, orientate ourselves in the world, if we can't have any sort of a map? To what do I refer? And the answer is, of course, that I can't orientate myself. and I can't have anything to turn to relate stuff to see what it means. So then if we can just put ourselves in that situation, I'm in a situation in which there's no possibility of orientation along any, in terms of any framework at all, zero orientation. And there's no way for me to compare stuff to some kind of yardstick so I can say what stuff means. So if that is the case, then what we have is the situation of complete openness. In complete openness, there is no up and there is no down, and there is no this way and there is no that way, and there is no before and there is no after. And I can't say what anything means. I can't say anything at all. Stuff's happening, but I can't say what it means. And not only that, but there's what that actually entails, because the only way I get to experience myself as this concrete or nuclear self, as in nucleated, as in a self as a nucleus or center, is by using a framework or using a yardstick or referring things to some kind of authoritative guide to tell me what things mean and to tell me which way I'm going. Am I progressing or regressing? Am I doing this or doing that? So as soon as I start doing this type of stuff, which is the type of stuff that the thinking mind does all the time, that is thought. So as soon as I start using thought, I'm orientated, I know what stuff is, and that means I've created the self. But there's a problem here, because this self that I've created isn't actually something that helps the situation in terms of clarity. It actually confuses it a lot more. And it confuses it a lot more because, as I was saying, there isn't a self, it's a polarity. That's an abstract kind of a gizmo. Sure, you can say that, talk about polarities and say here's a polarity and talk about it a lot, but it is always just an abstract gizmo. It can't tell us anything about reality. So the price we pay in order to be orientated, in order to be able to say what things are or what they mean, and also what I am, and possibly what I mean, or what life means, is to create an unreal, an abstract point of view that is the self. And once I've done that, everything does seem, I do have the illusion of positive knowledge, but it's a total illusion, because it is basically an extension of the ignorance or entropy that is needed to create the self in the first place. So really the world of positive knowledge that the self perceives is itself reflected back at itself in an unrecognized way. And all of that is a polarity, which means all of that adds up to nothing at all. So that is a way of talking about the disadvantage of obtaining orientation and obtaining the ability to know which way is up. Can you please tell me which way is up? And can you please tell me who I am? And can you please tell me what things mean? So we want to know the answers to those questions, because that's ontological security. And we want ontological security because we're absolutely terrified of the open situation, the situation of disorientation. But the price of going for this solution, in inverted commas, is that we enter into an ongoing illusion that doesn't get us anywhere, that creates loads of incoherence. Because whenever we rely on an illusion to make our way through life, that creates loads of incoherence, which in real terms just means trouble and strife. It means we have a really hard time. we have lots of suffering. So without any doubt, the most powerful force that is operating in our lives, powerful in the immediate sense in that it overrules everything else, is this desperate craving or need that we have to be able to orientate ourselves so we know which way is up, and we know who we are, and we know what stuff is, etc., etc. So this is like the fundamental force that which we can also call fear. That is the force of fear of openness. So the fear of openness, when we go along with that fear, when it takes possession of us and makes us do what fear makes us do, which is run away from fear, or the awareness which is causing fear, which is the wide open situation, which is the real situation, which is reality, we end up being wedded to a particular illusion that we can't see to be illusion, that creates loads and loads of suffering. So as soon as you put it like that, the terms are a little bit more familiar, and so you can see that that is the basic Buddhist formula about grasping and attachment leading to identification, which leads to suffering. But it's helpful to put it in the way that I just did put it, because we get so damn used to a formula, attachment causes suffering, that we repeat that formula, and we know the formula, and we think we actually know what the formula means, but it very quickly just becomes a formula. It just becomes another thought. So this gives us a very powerful way of looking at mental health. And what we can say is that when we are orientated or have an interest, might be a better way to put it, towards the true situation, what really is the truth, then that is mentally healthy, because we're coming back to a situation in which we're not being ruled by illusion. So really, mental health is about having a curiosity about the way things actually are, which is open. And kind of the better way of putting that maybe is just to say mental health is when we don't have any maps or models or theories or beliefs or opinions or methods or gimmicks or anything like that. So that's what mental health is. And there's no method to get like that. Okay, thank you.